He walked onto the plane with nothing but a cane and a calm smile. No flashy clothes, no loud voice, just a quiet presence. But within seconds, the flight attendant stopped him cold. She questioned his ID, held him back, and treated him like he didn't belong in first class. Passengers stared. No one spoke. What she didn't know was that the man she just humiliated wasn't only a retired federal judge, he was also one of the silent owners of the entire airline. And this flight? It was about to change everything. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today, and if you like this kind of story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a new one. He walked slowly toward the gate, holding a small leather bag in one hand and his boarding pass in the other. His name was Judge Harold King, though almost no one at the airport recognized him. His steps were steady but measured, aided by the wooden cane he had used ever since a car accident years ago. His coat was neat, his shoes polished, and his presence quiet, too quiet for most people to notice. He didn't wear expensive watches or designer sunglasses. He didn't act like someone important. But there was a calmness in the way he moved, a quiet strength that seemed to follow him like a shadow. No one looked twice. That was exactly how Harold preferred it. When he reached the gate, he handed his ticket to a young gate agent named Bilal, who scanned it without much interest. Bilal gave a small nod and waved him through. "You're good to go, sir. Have a nice flight." Harold nodded back politely and began walking down the jet bridge toward the plane. It was a short domestic flight, nothing complicated. And after all these years, Harold liked things that were simple. He had retired from the bench last year, after nearly 3 decades serving in courtrooms that tested his patience and strength. Today, all he wanted was a peaceful flight. At the aircraft door, a tall woman stood with her hands clasped in front of her. Her name was Monica, the lead flight attendant. She was in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a tighter smile. Her uniform was pressed perfectly, and her posture gave off a sense of strict control. As Harold stepped onto the plane, Monica greeted him with a thin smile. "Good afternoon, sir. May I see your boarding pass?" He handed it over without hesitation. She glanced at it, then looked up at him, her smile fading slightly. A small crease formed on her forehead. She handed the pass back but didn't move aside. "And your ID, please." Harold raised an eyebrow. "You've already seen my boarding pass." "Yes," she replied, her tone still polite but colder now. "But I need to verify your ID as well." A few nearby passengers turned to watch. Harold calmly reached into his coat and handed her his identification. She looked it over, then at him again. Her eyes narrowed, as if something didn't sit right. "This doesn't match what I was expecting," she said. "Where did you get this ticket?" Harold spoke softly but clearly. "I booked it online, same as everyone else." Monica hesitated, then said, "Please step aside. I need to confirm this with the gate staff." He didn't argue. Without a word, Harold moved to the side, standing just past the entrance. Other passengers began boarding behind him. Some gave him puzzled looks. Others avoided looking at him at all. Monica stepped to the front of the cabin and made a call on the cabin phone, speaking quietly but urgently. From her expression, it was clear she didn't believe he belonged in first class. A few minutes later, Rizwan, a ground supervisor, arrived at the plane. He looked slightly annoyed to be called but remained professional. He took the ID, glanced at Harold, then pulled out his phone and made a short call. His tone changed almost immediately. After a brief silence, he hung up and looked at Monica. "He's cleared," Rizwan said firmly. "Please let him take his seat." Monica looked confused. "But I thought—" "You thought wrong," he replied, his voice lower now. "He's good to go." Without another word, Monica stepped aside. Harold gave her a slight nod, not angry, not rude, just distant, and walked slowly down the aisle. He reached his first-class seat, placed his cane beside him, and sat down. His expression remained calm, his eyes thoughtful. No one welcomed him back. Monica didn't offer an apology. The nearby passengers looked down at their phones or out the window. No one had spoken up when he was stopped. And now no one wanted to face him. Harold sat quietly in his seat, fastening his seatbelt without a sound. The leather seat beneath him was soft, and the cabin lights gave off a warm glow, but none of it felt comfortable. His thoughts stayed fixed on what had just happened. He wasn't new to moments like that. They had followed him for most of his life. People questioning, second-guessing, treating him like he didn't belong, simply because he didn't look the part they expected. He had handled worse in courtrooms. This, however, still left a sting. It wasn't the words that hurt. It was the tone, the eyes, the assumption. Monica moved down the aisle, offering drinks to other first-class passengers with her usual rehearsed smile. She skipped Harold's row completely. Not a glance, not a word, as if avoiding him would erase what had happened at the entrance. He didn't react. He simply folded his hands and stared out the window. The sky outside was still clear. The runway stretched long ahead. But inside the cabin, the silence around him felt heavy. A man sitting 2 rows ahead, dressed in a navy blazer, leaned sideways and whispered to the woman beside him. They both glanced at Harold, then quickly looked away when he turned his head. He could feel their curiosity, the discomfort they didn't know how to hide. He wasn't angry at them. He was used to being judged. But something about today felt different. His phone buzzed once in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from someone named Faraz, his longtime friend and business partner. "Just landed in New York. Everything ready at the boardroom. Call me after your flight." Harold typed a short reply. "Delayed at boarding." Got questioned again. "I'm fine." Seconds later, another message appeared. "Same old story. Don't let it slide this time. People need reminding." Harold stared at those words for a moment, then put his phone away. He leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. The plane was nearly full now. The last few passengers were taking their seats. Monica stood near the front, whispering something to a junior attendant named Maywish, who looked toward Harold and then quickly looked away. Monica handed Maywish a stack of first-class menus and walked off toward the galley without a second glance at him. Harold opened his eyes, noticing how carefully the crew moved around him, not out of respect, out of discomfort. No one wanted to address what had happened. No one wanted to speak the truth out loud. He could feel it hanging in the air, invisible but thick. And he knew something they didn't. Something Monica definitely didn't. She had made a mistake, a very costly one, and the flight hadn't even taken off yet. The engines rumbled beneath the cabin floor as the plane began to taxi. Harold stayed still, his gaze fixed on the back of the seat in front of him. The hum of the plane did little to distract him from the cold silence around his seat. No greeting, no menu, not even a glass of water. Monica had gone back to treating him like he didn't exist, hoping the issue would disappear with enough distance and politeness. But Harold knew better. Ignoring a mistake didn't erase it. It only buried it deeper until it came back louder. Maywish, the junior attendant, moved softly through the aisle, her eyes lowered as she passed Harold. She paused a few seats ahead, nervously offering drinks to a couple who had been watching the earlier scene with interest. Harold noticed the way her hands trembled slightly as she poured sparkling water into a glass. He could tell she wasn't comfortable with how things were being handled. She was too quiet, too tense. She hadn't spoken a word to him either, but at least her silence didn't carry the same weight as Monica's. The captain's voice came over the speaker, calm and smooth. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've been cleared for takeoff. Please fasten your seat belts and make sure all devices are in airplane mode. Thank you for flying with us today." The plane turned slowly onto the runway, then picked up speed. Harold closed his eyes again as the aircraft lifted off the ground. It was always the same feeling, the small drop in his stomach, the slight pressure in his ears, and the brief moment of weightlessness before the cabin settled. He'd flown hundreds of times in his life. Still, every takeoff reminded him of how small the world could feel when you were surrounded by people who didn't see you fully. Once the seatbelt sign turned off, Monica reappeared at the front. She moved through the first-class cabin, smiling again, offering drinks, checking seat preferences, calling passengers by name, everything she was supposed to do. Until she reached Harold's row. She slowed, almost stopping, then walked right past him. No greeting, no drink, nothing. It was clear now. This wasn't forgetfulness. It was intentional. A silent punishment. One that she hoped would go unnoticed. But the man sitting across the aisle from Harold, a middle-aged software executive named Noman, noticed. He leaned back in his seat and glanced over. "She didn't offer you anything," he said softly. Harold turned toward him. "No, she didn't." Noman looked uneasy. "That doesn't seem right." Harold gave a faint smile, not bitter, not mocking. Just steady. "It's not." Noman looked away, unsure what to say next. Like most people in that cabin, he wasn't used to stepping into uncomfortable territory. It was easier to acknowledge a wrong quietly than speak up and risk becoming part of the story. Harold picked up his phone and opened his messages again. He scrolled past Faraz's texts and opened another thread. This one was with someone named Naveed. He typed, "Flight staff problem. Made me wait. Didn't believe my ticket. No apology. Being ignored now." A moment passed. Then the reply came. "Flight number?" Harold replied instantly. "A Z617, first class." There was no response after that, but he didn't need one. He placed the phone on the tray table and leaned back in his seat, hands resting calmly on his lap. The flight was only 1 hour and 40 minutes, but he had a feeling it was going to feel much longer for someone else on board. Up near the galley, Monica leaned against the counter, sipping from a paper cup as if the last hour hadn't happened. Her back was straight, her expression calm, but her fingers tapped restlessly against the tray beside her. She knew she'd pushed the limits when she stopped that man from boarding. She didn't like being questioned about her decisions, especially by ground staff. And now she felt embarrassed, though not because of what she'd done. It was because someone had cleared him, and she couldn't understand how someone like him had a seat in first class. Mehwish stood nearby, organizing cups and menus, trying to keep her distance. She glanced at Monica, then lowered her eyes quickly. Her voice was quiet when she finally spoke. "You sure he wasn't supposed to be in business class?" Monica shook her head, still watching the door to the cockpit. "I've worked this airline for 14 years. I know who usually flies up here." Mehwish hesitated, then said, "But his name was on the list." Monica rolled her eyes. "These things get mixed up all the time. Maybe someone gifted him a ticket, or maybe he pulled some strings. Either way, it didn't feel right. Something was off." Before Mehwish could respond, the intercom buzzed. Monica turned and picked it up. "Yes, this is Monica." A voice on the other end spoke briefly. Her face tightened. "Now?" she asked. The voice replied firmly. She nodded. "Understood." She hung up and stood still for a moment. Her eyes narrowed and her jaw clenched. Then without a word, she straightened her jacket and began walking toward the cockpit. The door opened, and the captain was waiting inside. He stepped aside, letting her in. Inside the small cockpit, the co-pilot nodded at her, but it was the third voice, coming from the screen of the internal satellite call, that changed everything. On the small monitor was the face of Samir, director of airline operations. He wasn't smiling. "Monica," he said, voice calm but cold. "We've received a direct call from the boardroom. There's a problem on your flight." Monica stood straight, hiding the tension in her shoulders. "What sort of problem, sir?" "A complaint from a first-class passenger," Samir said. "About being stopped at the gate and asked for additional ID. About being told they didn't look like they belonged." Monica's expression didn't change. "Sir, I followed protocol. The ID didn't match what I expected. I was being careful." Samir stared at her through the screen, unblinking. "That man is Judge Harold King." Monica blinked, just once. "Who?" "The same Harold King who served 28 years on the federal bench. The same man who now sits on the airline's advisory board. The same man who owns shares in this company." Monica's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Samir continued, "You didn't recognize him. Fine, You assumed he didn't belong, not fine, and now he's been sitting in first class without a drink, without proper service, while you walk past him like he doesn't exist. I didn't know, she said, voice low now. You will personally apologize to him. Right now, and not quietly. I want the rest of that cabin to hear it. Then you'll serve him directly. No more games. Monica nodded, barely. Her throat was tight. Understood. Samir's voice dropped lower. And when that plane lands, you'll be reporting to the board. Do you understand that? She swallowed hard. Yes, sir. The screen went dark. The cockpit was quiet for a moment. The captain looked at her, his expression unreadable. She turned and walked out, her steps slow, heavy. Her face was pale now. Her earlier confidence cracked. As she reached the curtain that separated the galley from the first-class cabin, she paused. The same silence she had given Judge King was now pressing down on her. And this time, there was nowhere to hide. Monica stepped through the curtain, her heart thudding inside her chest. Every row she passed felt longer than it should have. Every pair of eyes, even the ones pretending to look away, felt like they were watching her now. She had spent years moving through first-class cabins like she owned them, confident, respected, unquestioned. But not today. Today her legs felt heavy, her breath shallow. Her thoughts were scrambled, but one thing echoed loud in her head. He owns part of this airline. She had never imagined the man she dismissed so quickly could hold so much weight. Judge Harold King was seated exactly as she'd left him, still, composed, a folded newspaper resting on the tray table. His cane leaned beside him like a quiet witness. He didn't look up as she approached. He had heard the steps, of course. He knew what was coming. She stopped at his row, her palms damp, her mouth suddenly dry. Passengers nearby shifted slightly, pretending to stay focused on their screens or books, but their ears were fully open. The man across the aisle, Noman, glanced over, then quickly looked away again. A woman 2 rows back slowly removed her headphones. The tension was thick and silent. Monica crouched slightly, lowering herself to his eye level. Her voice was low, but not low enough to go unheard. "Mr. King," she began, forcing the words out. "I'd like to apologize for earlier. There was a misunderstanding during boarding. I shouldn't have questioned your credentials." Harold finally lifted his eyes and met hers. Calm, firm, but unreadable. "A misunderstanding," he repeated quietly. Monica nodded quickly. "Yes. I didn't recognize your name and wanted to be careful with the manifest." Harold let a pause stretch between them before speaking. "You didn't ask anyone else in this cabin for ID." Monica's lips parted, but no answer came. "You asked me, loudly, in front of everyone," he continued, voice calm but cutting. "You asked for more proof than you made me wait while others boarded." The nearby passengers froze. Monica's hands trembled slightly as she held them together. "I didn't mean to offend you," she said. "It wasn't personal." "But it was," Harold replied. "That's the problem. You didn't know me. You didn't know my name or my history or my position. You saw what I looked like, and you decided something about me." He wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. Every word hit harder than if he had shouted. Monica felt her face flush as the truth settled in the air between them. She had said those exact words. "You don't look like you belong here." Not in those words, but in her tone, in her posture, in how she treated him like a problem to be dealt with. "I'm sorry," she said again, this time more quietly. "I'll make sure you're properly served for the rest of the flight." Harold didn't respond. He turned his eyes back to his newspaper and opened it to the next page. That simple gesture, his silence, carried more weight than any further conversation. Monica stood slowly, then walked back toward the galley. This time she could feel it, the glances, the shift. The passengers who had ignored the situation earlier were now wide awake. Some looked embarrassed, some curious. A few exchanged whispers now that they knew who he was. In the galley, Mehwish stood frozen, eyes wide. "What happened?" she whispered as Monica passed. Monica didn't answer. She grabbed the tray and began arranging the drinks. her hands moving faster now, trying to distract herself. But her mind was spinning. She had never been corrected in front of passengers before. She had never been called out for behavior she thought was just part of the job, her judgment, her instinct. But now, she realized it wasn't just a simple mistake. She hadn't followed protocol. She had followed her bias. And Judge Harold King had made sure the entire cabin saw it for what it was. And they still had more than an hour left in the air. The silence around Harold's seat had changed. It wasn't the awkward silence from earlier, where everyone pretended he wasn't there. Now it was heavier, uncomfortable, like the room after someone had said something no one could take back. He sat with his newspaper open, eyes scanning the page, but he wasn't really reading. His mind stayed sharp, alert to every movement, every shift in the atmosphere. He wasn't a man who liked attention, but he'd lived long enough to know that some moments required it. He had learned long ago that staying silent didn't mean staying weak. It meant choosing where your voice mattered most. And Monica's apology, if it could even be called that, hadn't been about truth. It had been about fear. She didn't regret what she had done. She regretted who he turned out to be. Across the aisle, Noman stole another glance at him. Then, surprisingly, he leaned forward slightly and spoke. "Sir, I hope you don't mind me saying. I saw what happened earlier. I should have said something. I didn't, and I'm sorry." Harold turned his head and studied him, his expression calm. "It's easier to stay quiet," Harold said, "until silence starts to feel like agreement." Noman nodded, eyes lowered. "You're right, I should have known better." Harold gave a small nod, then looked back at his newspaper. The conversation ended there, but the moment lingered. The other passengers had heard it too. No one else spoke, but the air was filled with quiet shame. In the galley, Monica stood at the counter, pouring drinks with stiff hands. She carefully placed a glass of sparkling water and a small bowl of nuts on a tray. Her eyes darted toward Mehwish, who was still watching her. "I need to deliver this myself," Monica said, her voice low and tight. Mehwish hesitated. "You sure? I can take it." "No," Monica said quickly. "It has to be me." With the tray in hand, Monica walked back down the aisle. Each step felt heavier than the last. She was used to controlling the mood in her cabin. Today, the mood controlled her. As she reached Harold's seat, she forced a polite smile. "Would you like something to drink, Mr. King? Sparkling water? Or would you prefer something else?" He didn't look up immediately. When he did, he simply said, "That's fine." She placed the tray gently on the table, trying to keep her hand steady. "If you need anything else, just let me know." Harold stared at the drink, then lifted his eyes slowly. "You didn't offer me anything when I first sat down," he said quietly. "You skipped me completely." Monica froze. I was busy attending to other passengers." "But not all of them," he replied. "Only the ones you believed belonged here." Monica felt her cheeks burn. Her throat tightened as she tried to find the right words. But none came. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Harold didn't press further. He didn't need to. The silence between them was loud enough. He picked up the glass and took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving hers. She turned and walked away, her face flushed, her chest tight. As she passed the rows, she could feel it again. Those stares she used to ignore. Except this time, they weren't looking at her with admiration or respect. They were watching her with judgment, with quiet disbelief, maybe even disgust. People who had seen her dozens of times on other flights now saw her differently. She ducked back into the galley, nearly bumping into Mehwish. "What did he say?" Mehwish asked quietly. Monica didn't answer. She just stood there, her back to the galley wall, breathing harder than she should have. Everything was unraveling. Her control, her confidence. The mask she wore so easily on every flight. It was cracking, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. In the cockpit, the captain reached for the in-flight phone. He dialed the number for ground operations, his voice steady as always. "This is flight AZ-617, he said. "Approaching cruising altitude. Prepare for arrival in approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes. There was a short pause on the other end, then a voice replied. Understood, Captain. Mr. Naveed has requested a full debrief as soon as the flight lands. Security will meet the plane at the gate. He wants a crew member pulled for questioning. The captain didn't ask who. He already knew. Copy that, he said. We'll be ready. And with that, the final hour of the flight began. Quiet above the clouds, but with a storm waiting just beyond the runway. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft settled into cruising altitude, but the tension remained sharp, unshaken. Harold sat quietly, sipping from his glass, the chill of the sparkling water crisp against his lips. He didn't rush. He didn't speak. And yet the silence around him had grown heavier, like a weight pressing down on everyone seated nearby. The performance of luxury and politeness in first class had cracked. Behind the warm smiles and folded napkins, something real had surfaced, and now no one knew what to do with it. 2 rows behind, a woman named Sadia, dressed in a tailored pantsuit and working on her laptop, glanced at Harold again. She had watched the entire scene unfold, quietly like most of the others. But now she couldn't focus. The words on her screen blurred. She closed the laptop slowly, leaned back, and stared at the ceiling. Monica had returned to the galley, but she hadn't touched a single thing on the counter since. She stood frozen, her arms folded tightly across her chest, pretending to study a service checklist. Mehwish stood a few steps away, awkwardly pretending to check supplies. She finally spoke after several long minutes. You should sit down. You don't look well. I'm fine, Monica snapped, her voice sharper than she meant. No, you're not, Mehwish said gently. You haven't moved in 10 minutes. Monica's jaw tightened. You think I did something wrong, don't you? Mehwish hesitated. I think you judged too fast. Monica turned sharply, eyes flashing. You don't know what it's like. Every day we have people trying to sneak into seats they didn't pay for. I've seen it too many times. That wasn't today, Mehwish replied quietly. Those words hung between them like a stone in the air. Meanwhile, in C2A, Harold leaned back, lifting his phone from the tray. Another message from Naveed had arrived. Security team briefed. You won't need to speak. Just stay seated after landing. He tapped a reply. Understood. She apologized publicly. The response came almost instantly. Apology is not accountability. She'll answer to the board. Harold stared at the screen for a moment, then slowly put the phone down. He wasn't looking for revenge, but he had spent too many years watching people in power avoid consequences. He wasn't going to be part of that pattern, especially not when the behavior stayed hidden behind professionalism and company uniforms. Across the aisle, Noman kept shifting in his seat. His guilt hadn't gone away since earlier. Finally, he cleared his throat and leaned a bit closer, his voice low but earnest. Sir, I just want to say, again, I'm sorry for staying quiet, for letting her speak to you like that. Harold looked at him, his gaze steady. You said something now. That matters. Noman exhaled. I've seen this kind of thing before. Not always this clear, but you spoke so calmly. That's what shook everyone, I think. You didn't raise your voice, but nobody could ignore you. Harold didn't smile, but his voice softened. The louder you speak, the easier they tune you out. He turned his head toward the aisle, eyes watching the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the aircraft. Behind that curtain, a whole different world flew, a place where passengers didn't get hot towels or hand-delivered drinks. He had flown back there too, many times. And he knew this kind of thing wasn't rare. It was just quieter back there, less likely to be noticed, easier to deny. Suddenly, a voice came through the intercom. It was the captain. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent in about 45 minutes. Please remain in your seats for the time being. Our crew will come through with one final service shortly. Monica heard the announcement from the galley, and it snapped her back into motion. She reached for a fresh tray, hands moving automatically. Cups, water bottles, snacks, napkins. But the calm rhythm of her work had vanished. Each movement now felt clumsy, her fingers unsure. Her thoughts were louder than the engine hum. She had always believed she was good at her job, efficient, professional, firm when needed. She followed procedure, or so she thought. But now she couldn't stop thinking about the look in Harold's eyes. Not anger, not revenge, just disappointment, the kind that made you feel small without saying much at all. As she turned toward the aisle to begin the final service, her legs hesitated for a brief second. She wasn't sure if she had the strength to walk past him again, but she knew she would have to, because the real landing hadn't happened yet. And what waited at the gate would be far harder to face than any apology she had given mid-air. The tray felt heavier in Monica's hands than it ever had before. She carried it down the aisle slowly, her posture straight but forced, the smile on her face paper-thin. For years, she had walked this same path down countless flights, serving drinks, calming complaints, enforcing rules. But never like this. Never with the weight of shame pressing on her shoulders like a second uniform. Every step closer to Harold's row reminded her of the moment that started it all, when she looked at a man in a simple coat, holding a first-class ticket, and decided he didn't belong. Now she was walking back to him, tray in hand, fully aware that everyone in the cabin was watching again. Only this time they weren't watching him. They were watching her. She reached Harold's row and paused. He didn't look up at her. He was reading again, or at least pretending to. The newspaper lay neatly folded in his lap. His posture relaxed, but his presence filled the space around him. Monica cleared her throat softly. "Would you like another drink, Mr. King? We have freshly brewed coffee, juice, or anything else you prefer." Harold didn't move at first. Then he looked up slowly and met her eyes. The look was calm, but not indifferent. There was something piercing in his gaze, like he could see straight through her politeness. "Now you're offering?" he asked, his voice quiet. Monica's throat tightened. "I apologize for earlier," she said again. "Truly." He didn't speak. The pause between them stretched longer than she could bear. Then, with a slight nod, he said, "Black coffee." Monica nodded quickly, almost with relief, and turned to pour the drink from the thermos on her tray. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the cup steady, making sure not to spill a drop. She handed it to him carefully, then set a napkin down beside it. "Thank you," Harold said. 2 simple words, but not the kind she could feel proud of. She moved on quickly, continuing her service down the aisle, but her steps were quicker now, less controlled. Behind her, whispers had begun again. This time, they weren't about Harold. They were about her. Back in the galley, Mewish waited near the counter, arms crossed, watching Monica return. Her face was unreadable. "I gave him coffee," Monica muttered, setting down the tray. "That's not going to fix this," Mewish replied softly. Monica didn't answer. She didn't know how. For the first time in her career, she had run out of answers. Meanwhile, Harold took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the warmth settle in his chest. His eyes shifted to the window. Below them, the clouds drifted like slow-moving rivers. The plane had started its quiet descent, but no announcement had come yet. He tapped his phone awake and glanced at the screen. Another message from Naveed had come in. "Security is in position. Airline executive team will meet us at the bridge. You won't be bothered. Just stay seated." He tapped a short reply. "Copy. Keep it quiet." Naveed's answer was quick. "Won't be a scene, but it won't be forgotten." Harold locked the screen again and placed the phone back on the tray. He wasn't looking for drama. He didn't want to embarrass Monica. He just wanted truth. Accountability. A sign that the people in power, no matter what uniform they wore, could no longer brush aside their decisions like spilled water on a tray. 2 rows behind him, Sadia finally found the courage to speak. She leaned forward and spoke softly, just loud enough for Harold to hear. "Sir, if I may, thank you for how you handled everything." Harold turned slightly. "Handled what?" "The way she treated you, the way you responded, it showed everyone something." Harold tilted his head, curious. "And what was that?" That you didn't need to raise your voice to show power, Sadia said. You reminded people what respect actually looks like. He gave a small nod, eyes thoughtful. Sometimes the loudest thing in the room is how you choose to stay calm. Sadia smiled faintly. Well, it was noticed, at least by a few of us. Harold returned his gaze to the window, his reflection faintly visible against the glass. Down below, the land was beginning to appear between the clouds. City grids, highway lines, airport lights blinking faintly in the distance, and up in the air, without anyone knowing it yet, a quiet reckoning was already descending. The aircraft began its slow descent, and with it, the weight of what was waiting below settled deeper in Monica's chest. She stood in the galley again, gripping the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. The usual noise of trays clinking and crew chatter was missing. Even Mewish, usually light-hearted and full of quiet jokes, said nothing now. The tension had crept into every corner of the plane. Monica's thoughts raced in every direction. The apology, the coffee, the forced smile. None of it had changed the way the cabin looked at her now. The same passengers who used to greet her warmly, who used to call her by name, were now giving her those long, sideways glances. Not loud, not angry, but full of something else. Quiet judgment. She knew what they were thinking. They had seen enough to understand what happened. She'd treated a man with suspicion, dismissed him, humiliated him, and all because he didn't look like what she expected in seat 2A. And now, every second of that moment was catching up to her. I've never seen you like this, Mewish said quietly, breaking the silence between them. Monica didn't turn. She just kept her hands on the counter. Because I've never been in a position like this. Mewish hesitated. Maybe this isn't about the position. Maybe it's about the choice. Monica turned her head slowly. What's that supposed to mean? You chose to stop him. You chose to question him. No one told you to. That came from you. The words hit harder than Mewish intended, but she didn't take them back. Monica opened her mouth, ready to defend herself, but nothing came out. She had used those same defenses her whole career. I was following procedure. It didn't feel right. I've seen people cheat the system before. But now those reasons sounded hollow, even to her. She lowered her eyes. I didn't think it would turn into this. You didn't think it mattered, Mewish replied gently. That's the problem. The announcement from the cockpit interrupted them, the captain's voice steady as ever. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now on final approach. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened, tray tables are upright, and all personal items are stowed. Flight crew, prepare for landing. The words echoed through the cabin like a signal, not just for descent, but for confrontation. Monica moved to check the cabin one last time. Her steps were slower now, heavier, like she was dragging invisible chains behind her. She checked seatbelts, nodded at passengers, avoided eye contact with the ones who stared back. When she reached Harold's row, she paused. His seatbelt was already fastened. He didn't look at her. Landing in about 10 minutes, she said softly. Let me know if there's anything you need. He gave no reply. She stood there for a second longer, waiting for something. Forgiveness, maybe. A sign that she had done enough, that she had patched the hole she tore open earlier. But none came. She turned and walked away. Back in his seat, Harold's eyes remained steady on the skyline out his window. The airport had come into view now, rows of gates, moving trucks, flashing runway lights. The plane dipped slightly, lining up with the runway. The wheels beneath groaned softly as they prepared for landing. Harold reached for his phone one last time and checked the latest message from Naveed. Executive team and security waiting at gate. Her badge will be pulled before passengers disembark, quietly. No delays. He stared at the words. Not with anger, not even satisfaction. Just a quiet acceptance. Not long ago, he might have just let it go. Chalked it up to another moment in a long history of being judged. But this time he had chosen to say something. Not for himself. but because too many others never had that chance. Behind him, the cabin was filled with silence. Some passengers had their eyes closed, pretending to nap. Others stared blankly ahead. But no one was really resting. They were waiting to see what would happen the moment the plane stopped. As the aircraft lowered its wheels and made its final glide toward the runway, Monica stood in the front, her hands folded tightly in front of her, her heart pounding loud enough to drown out the engine noise. She had never feared landing before, but this time, the runway didn't mean the end of a shift. It meant the start of something she couldn't avoid. The wheels hit the runway with a soft thud, followed by the familiar vibration that ran through the cabin floor. Outside the window, the world moved in streaks, runway lights flashing past, buildings shrinking closer, ground vehicles frozen in motion as the plane slowed to a crawl. Inside the aircraft, there was no usual applause, no relieved chatter from passengers eager to get off and return to their lives. This landing was different. It was quiet. Too quiet. Monica stood near the front of the cabin, her face composed but pale, her breathing shallow. She kept one hand on the wall to steady herself. Her mind wasn't on landing procedures or passenger safety announcements. It was on the conversation she'd had in the cockpit, on the man now seated just a few rows behind her, on the quiet message she knew had been passed from someone above her station to someone much higher. The kind of message that didn't go through standard forms or reports. The kind that ended careers. The intercom crackled again. The captain's voice came through, cool and routine. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to your destination. Local time is 3:47 p.m. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we arrive at the gate and the seatbelt sign has been turned off. On behalf of our crew, thank you for flying with us." The seatbelt sign dinged on, then off. But no one moved. At the gate, a black sedan waited just beyond the glass jet bridge. Next to it stood two sharply dressed airline executives and a uniformed airport security officer. No one else was around. The door of the plane hadn't opened yet, and Monica hadn't received clearance to begin disembarkation. In first class, Harold remained seated, calm and upright, his cane resting beside his leg, his phone still in his hand. He hadn't said a word since the plane touched the ground, and yet his silence filled the entire front of the cabin. The passengers around him had stopped pretending to scroll through their phones. No one stood. No one asked to exit first. They were waiting too. Monica stepped toward the door, headset still in place, and pressed the call button for the gate agent. "This is Flight AZ-617. We've landed. Awaiting confirmation to open door 1. The voice on the other end didn't come right away. When it did, it was clipped and professional. "Hold for instruction. Executives will board momentarily." Monica's mouth went dry. Executives. Plural? Her heart pounded harder now, pressing against her ribs. She turned around slowly, facing the first-class cabin, and for the first time in all her years flying, she felt like a passenger herself. Stuck, unable to move, waiting for someone else to decide what would happen next. A moment later, there was a soft knock on the door from the outside. Maywish opened it. 3 people stepped onto the plane. The first was Naveed, director of airline operations. He was dressed in a dark gray suit, his face unreadable, his pace steady. Next to him was Sajid, head of crew training, and behind them, the airport security officer who had stood silently by the jet bridge. The moment Naveed entered the cabin, eyes began to shift. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look around. He walked forward with quiet authority and stopped in front of Monica. She stood straight, hands folded in front of her, trying to hold herself together. "Monica," he said softly, "you'll come with us now." The air in the cabin changed instantly. Passengers looked up, heads turned. No one said a word, but their expressions spoke volumes. Everyone understood what this meant. This wasn't routine. This wasn't a post-flight check. This was consequence. Monica swallowed hard but nodded. "Yes, sir." Before she could turn to leave, Naveed added, "Please hand your ID badge to Mr. Sajid." Her heart dropped. Her ID badge? She hesitated. Then, with shaking hands, she unclipped the metal badge from her jacket and passed it over. Sajid didn't say anything. He took it and placed it in his pocket. The action was simple. But to Monica, it felt like being stripped of everything she had worked for. 14 years, dozens of promotions, thousands of hours in the sky. And now, all of it undone in the quiet turn of a keycard. As she turned to walk down the aisle behind the executives, she glanced briefly toward Harold. He was still seated, still composed, watching, but not gloating, not even angry, just watching. And somehow, that made it worse. Monica kept her head down as she walked past the rows of passengers, her feet moving slowly, her face burning. Not a single person said a word. Not a single passenger offered sympathy. She was invisible now, but not in the way she used to be in control. She reached the aircraft door and stepped off. Harold looked forward again, letting out a long, steady breath. The moment had passed, but the ripple it caused was just beginning to move through the rest of the world. The door closed behind Monica with a gentle click, but the silence that followed in the first-class cabin felt louder than anything they had heard on the flight. Harold remained seated, calm as ever, his cane resting beside his foot, his newspaper untouched since takeoff. Passengers all around him sat stiffly, the weight of the last few hours finally beginning to settle in their minds. Not one of them had spoken up when Monica confronted him. Not one had intervened while she dismissed him in front of everyone. Now they were realizing what that silence had cost. A few rows behind Harold, Sadia sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had been traveling for a business seminar, but the lesson she was taking home wasn't in her notebook or on her laptop. She had witnessed something ugly. She had watched it unfold, and like the others, she had done nothing to stop it. Her chest felt heavy with that truth. To her left, Noman was still seated, fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. He had tried to offer an apology earlier, but now even that felt small, meaningless. A man like Harold didn't need apologies. He needed people to stop letting things like this happen. After several minutes, a young gate agent named Ikra stepped onto the plane and cleared her throat softly. "Mr. King," she said, speaking with respect, "your car is waiting. You're welcome to disembark first." Harold didn't rush. He slowly rose from his seat, picking up his coat and adjusting the strap of his leather bag. He reached for his cane, steadying himself with the grace of a man who had faced much worse than turbulence. His back straight, his eyes forward, he walked past the other passengers without a single glance in their direction. But they watched him. Every single one of them watched as he walked toward the front of the aircraft. Not as someone who had just been served coffee late, but as a man who had changed the entire mood of the cabin without raising his voice. His silence had held power. His presence had exposed something people didn't want to admit still existed in places like this. Assumption, bias, quiet discrimination dressed in professional clothing. As he stepped through the door, the air felt different. Crisper, sharper. Waiting for him was a black sedan with a driver in a suit, standing beside it with the door already open. Naveed was there too, his phone pressed to his ear, nodding respectfully as Harold approached. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Harold slid into the back seat, his cane resting against his leg, and the door closed softly behind him. Inside the aircraft, the rest of the passengers finally began to move, but slowly. No one rushed to the aisle like usual. There was no pushing, no chatter. Just a strange, uncomfortable quiet. A few eyes were damp, a few faces still red from guilt. Sadia stood and retrieved her bag from the overhead bin. As she waited for the line to move, she looked at Mehwish, who was now standing at the front, preparing to say goodbye to each passenger. "Was she fired?" Sadia asked gently. Mehwish paused, choosing her words carefully. No one said the word, but they didn't need to. Sadia nodded once. "I hope she thinks about what she did." Mehwish's reply was simple. "She will." Farther down the aisle, Noman helped an elderly woman with her bag, quietly trying to do something, anything, to feel useful. But deep down he knew this wasn't something a kind gesture could erase. The passengers exited one by one, each carrying their luggage. And now, something else. A memory of what they had seen and how they had responded. Or didn't. Outside, Harold's car began to move away from the gate. He sat silently in the back, staring out the window as terminals passed by. His phone buzzed on the seat beside him. It was a message from Faraz. Board heard everything. Policies will be reviewed this week. You started something bigger than just one flight. Harold read the message and let it sit. He didn't reply right away, because he knew what Faraz meant. This wasn't about the seat. It wasn't about coffee or titles, or whether an apology came too late. It was about the rules people follow when they think no one will hold them accountable, the way they see others when they don't expect consequences, the quiet decisions made in seconds that reveal far more than the ones written in handbooks. And sometimes it only takes one man sitting quietly in seat 2A to remind an entire company, an entire system, what justice really looks like. No podium, no courtroom, just presence and truth. By the time Harold's car exited the airport grounds, the news had already reached the airline's executive office downtown. Word of the incident, discreet but undeniable, had spread from the flight report to department heads, then to board members, then into internal chat channels where leadership whispered, "Did you hear what happened on AZ 617? The message was consistent. A senior flight attendant had removed and disrespected a man who not only belonged in first class, but also owned part of the very company she worked for. And worse, she had done so not out of procedural error, but personal judgment. In a quiet conference room lined with glass and polished wood, 6 high-ranking executives sat around a long table. At the head sat Zara Malik, Vice President of Corporate Affairs. Her fingers were laced tightly together, her eyes sharp as she reviewed the printed flight log. Beside her sat Rehan Sattar, Director of Crew Management, and Naveed, just returned from the airport. No one spoke for several seconds. The silence was deliberate. Zara finally looked up from the papers. "So, we had a senior crew member stop a first-class passenger, question his ID, delay him from boarding, deny him service, and only after realizing his identity, attempt a public apology?" Naveed nodded. "Correct." "She didn't recognize him," Rehan answered. "Apparently not. She claimed it was a mismatch in the manifest, but it wasn't. He was properly ticketed, properly seated and cleared before the doors even opened." Zara leaned back in her chair. "This isn't about the ticket." "No," Naveed replied. "It's about how she saw him and what she assumed." Across the table, Asim Khan, head of legal compliance, closed his folder. "He hasn't pressed any formal complaint yet, not through legal. No media, no statement." Zara turned to Naveed again. "Do you think he will?" "I don't think he needs to," Naveed said calmly. "What happened on that flight said enough, and the passengers saw it. Word will spread." Zara tapped her fingers once, twice, slowly. "We can't afford this to become public before we address it internally. We need action. Not damage control, real change." She stood, walked over to the large whiteboard near the window, and uncapped a marker. In big, bold letters she wrote, "Policy review, training overhaul, public commitment," then underlined them all. "We announce a review of all in-flight service protocols. We implement new training on implicit bias, and we issue a statement, general, not naming anyone, but one that makes it clear. This company will not tolerate any form of discrimination, no matter how subtle." Naveed nodded. "And Monica?" "She's suspended until further notice. Her employment status will be reviewed after a formal disciplinary hearing." "She'll fight it," Rehan warned. "She's been here for 14 years. She'll say it was procedural." Zara turned slowly. "Then she can explain why she didn't stop the man in business class wearing sneakers and headphones, or the man with no carry-on, or the woman who walked past without showing her ID." No one answered, because the answer was already clear. Meanwhile, in the black sedan now pulling into a quiet residential neighborhood, Harold sat still. The engine hummed softly as the driver parked outside his home. He didn't reach for the door right away. Instead, he picked up his phone and reread Faraz's message. "You started something bigger than just one flight." Harold replied simply, "Good." It was time. He stepped out of the car, cane in hand, and walked slowly toward the front door of his house. The air smelled of fresh rain. The evening breeze brushed gently across his face. He paused before going inside, looking up at the sky. Just a faint trail of clouds left from the plane he'd been on an hour ago. He didn't feel victorious, not satisfied, not angry. He just felt tired. Tired of moments like today, of having to carry his dignity like a shield, in rooms where people looked straight through him. But also, he felt resolved, because today the silence didn't win. Today something cracked in the wall, and from the other side, people had finally heard it. 2 days later, the airline quietly published a new press release on its website. No bold headlines, no dramatic statements, just a clean, carefully worded message from the communications department. Short, precise, and intentional. "We are reviewing our current in-flight service procedures after a recent internal incident. The company remains committed to ensuring that all passengers, regardless of appearance or background, are treated with dignity, fairness, and respect. We are taking steps to update crew training programs with a renewed focus on equity, accountability, and unbiased service. We thank those who uphold our values every day and recognize there is more work to be done." It didn't name Harold. It didn't mention the flight. But those who were on board AZ-617 knew exactly what the statement meant. Inside his study, Harold sat at his desk reading the press release on his laptop. A small cup of tea sat beside him, untouched, now gone cold. The room was quiet except for the ticking of a large clock above the bookshelf. He read the paragraph 3 times, not because he didn't understand it, but because he knew what wasn't being said between the lines. This wasn't the company admitting guilt. This was the company recognizing its fear of the truth getting louder. But even that, Harold knew, was progress, because silence had always been the system's favorite hiding place. And now, silence was cracking. On the far side of the room, a large manila envelope rested on the table, an invitation from the airline's board, asking him to attend a private policy review meeting as a shareholder. They didn't call it a disciplinary panel. They didn't say it directly, but he knew. They wanted to show him they were taking this seriously, that this wouldn't just be forgotten. He didn't answer the letter right away. Across the city, Monica sat on a small bench in a waiting room outside Human Resources. She wore a plain navy blouse and black slacks, clothes she hadn't worn in years, back when she was still new to the company and unsure of herself. Now she sat with both hands in her lap, staring at the floor tiles. No badge, no uniform, no control. She had been through the motions since the day of the landing, phone calls, internal interviews, written statements. She had cried once, only once, in her car just after handing in her badge, not because she had been caught, but because for the first time she had been forced to look at herself through someone else's eyes. And what she saw, how quick she had been to assume how cold her voice had sounded, had shaken something in her. She remembered the look on Harold's face. Not anger, not pride, just disappointment. It was the kind of look that stayed with you in quiet moments. Inside the HR office, the disciplinary panel sat waiting. Her file lay open on the desk, her years of service listed neatly on paper, her accomplishments, her awards, her evaluations. But so was the incident report from AZ-617. So were the statements from Mehwish, Noman, Sadia, and other passengers. None of them had been cruel. None had demanded punishment. But they had told the truth. He was calm, one had written. She was dismissive. It wasn't about the ID, another said. She judged him before he even spoke. And Mehwish's statement was the hardest to read. Monica is good at her job, but that day, she wasn't being a crew leader. She was being a gatekeeper, and she shut the wrong gate. Monica had read that line over and over, and she knew it was true. At Harold's house, his phone buzzed softly, a new message from Naveed. Training overhaul approved. First session next week. You've been invited as keynote. Harold stared at the message. He hadn't asked for this role. He wasn't trying to become a symbol. But maybe it wasn't about that. Maybe it was about not letting the next man in seat 2A go through the same thing. He picked up the phone and typed a simple reply. "I'll be there." Then he set the phone down, stood up, and walked toward the window. Outside, the wind carried soft golden light through the trees. The sky was clear, no noise, no spotlight, just quiet movement forward. And this time, it wouldn't stop at the runway. A week later, the training hall at the airline's main operations center filled slowly with employees, flight attendants, ground crew, cabin leads, trainers, and a few newly promoted team leaders. Most came quietly, some curious, others tense. A few had only heard whispers about what had happened on AZ-617. Others knew every detail but hadn't said a word outside their team groups. But they all understood something important. Today was not routine. The chairs were arranged in neat rows facing a raised platform with a plain wooden podium. Behind it, a large screen displayed the airline's logo and 3 words underneath it in bold black letters: dignity, equality, accountability. The mood in the room was different from other corporate events. There were no cheerful welcome videos, no upbeat music, just quiet footsteps, murmurs, and the occasional glance toward the empty podium. In the front row, Naveed sat reviewing a short introduction speech, but his focus kept drifting to the back of the room, waiting. Mehwish entered quietly, her uniform crisp, a small notebook in hand. She found a seat at the end of the 3rd row. Monica was not present. Her case was still under internal review. The hearing panel had postponed final decisions until after today's session. Then the room shifted. Subtle, but clear. Heads turned. The back doors opened. Harold entered. He wore a dark gray blazer, no tie, a simple watch on his wrist. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, but the effect was immediate. He didn't walk like a guest. He walked like someone who had something to say and nothing to prove. People stood as he passed the rows, not because they were told to, but because it felt like the right thing to do. He nodded politely as he reached the front and shook hands with Naveed. The 2 men exchanged no formal introductions. Their conversation had started long before this day. Naveed stepped aside. Harold took his place at the podium. There was no microphone adjustment, no shuffle of papers. He didn't need notes. He just looked out over the room at the faces waiting, some uncomfortable, some open, some guarded. Then he began. "I wasn't supposed to speak here today. I didn't ask for this role. I didn't want to stand in front of anyone with a title or a badge or a list of awards. I just wanted to fly home that day, quietly, peacefully, like everyone else." The room was silent. But that day, someone looked at me and made a decision based on how I looked, what I wore, the color of my skin. And that decision didn't feel small. It wasn't about a seat number or an ID. It was about whether I was treated with basic respect, whether I was seen as someone who belonged. Harold paused, letting his words sit heavy in the air. And what's worse than that decision is how everyone around it stayed quiet. Not because they were bad people, not because they agreed, but because silence is easy. A few heads lowered in the audience. I've spent decades in rooms like this, courtrooms, boardrooms, classrooms. And the one thing I've learned is that silence is the strongest shield injustice has. When good people say nothing, bad choices grow roots. He looked toward the back rows where a few senior trainers sat. But it doesn't have to stay that way. He stepped out from behind the podium now, walking slowly, his cane tapping softly against the floor. "I'm not here to shame anyone. I'm not here to end careers. What happened on that flight didn't start with one woman. It started with a culture, a habit, a system that allows quiet bias to pass as procedure, a system that teaches crew to recognize rules more than respect, to memorize steps, but ignore people." He stopped at the edge of the stage. "But if we can train our staff to memorize 147 safety codes, we can train them to recognize bias in their own eyes. If we can teach them how to handle mid-air fires and medical emergencies, We can teach them how to treat every person in every seat as someone who matters. He looked across the room once more. This isn't about diversity slogans printed in brochures. This is about the difference between safety and comfort, between being allowed to board and being welcomed, between being cleared and being respected. Then, in a voice steady but filled with quiet power, he added, "From today onward, if this company truly wants to fly above the clouds, it must start by standing firmly on the ground, with both feet planted in fairness." He gave a final nod, then walked back to his seat. The room stayed still for several seconds. No claps, no movement, just deep silence filled with reflection. Then slowly, one hand clapped, then another. And then the room erupted, not in loud applause, but in steady, meaningful recognition. The kind that didn't celebrate a speaker, but a shift, a change, a beginning. Harold sat back in his chair, calm once again, his cane resting across his knees. And as the airline's first anti-bias training began behind him, a quiet truth settled in the room. The flight had ended, but the journey had finally begun. A month later, the story of Flight AZ617 had become something else entirely. Not a scandal, not a headline, but a case study, passed from training room to training room, from policy manual to HR seminar. Employees spoke about it cautiously at first, unsure whether it was safe to ask questions. But then something changed. Slowly, more voices began to speak openly. Cabin crew from other bases, junior attendants from regional hubs, even managers from departments that rarely saw passengers began asking the same thing. What really happened on that flight? And more importantly, what are we doing to make sure it doesn't happen again? The answer didn't come in a press release or a viral video. It came through a quiet shift, less visible but more lasting. Flight attendants were no longer trained just in customer service, but in conscious awareness. Ground agents were taught not just to match names with IDs, but to match procedures with empathy. The airline's orientation now included a simple exercise. Before you decide someone doesn't belong, ask yourself why you believe that. And for the first time in its history, the airline's training department invited a retired federal judge to review their internal code of conduct. Harold never once mentioned Monica by name. He didn't need to. What mattered wasn't her punishment. What mattered was her reflection. And in a quiet letter sent weeks later, typed, sealed, and hand-delivered to his home, Monica offered that reflection with unshaking honesty. "I looked at you and saw a question mark, a mistake, something out of place, and that's my failure, not yours. I thought I was protecting the cabin. I was protecting my assumptions. I thought I was following protocol. I was following fear. I thought you were in the wrong seat, but I was the one who needed to move." Harold read the letter alone in his study, then folded it gently and placed it into a drawer. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. Some answers don't live in words. They live in change. Across the city, in a glass building marked by polished floors and quiet elevators, the airline's executive board convened for their quarterly review. Zahra Malik led the meeting. Her first slide showed a bar graph. Crew satisfaction had risen. Passenger complaints had dropped. But the final slide showed something more important. A list of names of passengers who had reported being treated with new levels of care, calm, and courtesy. Unprompted, untrained, real change. In the corner of the screen beneath that list, a quiet footnote read, Aziz 617, standard rewritten. At home, Harold sat on his back porch, wrapped in a sweater as the early evening breeze swept through the yard. His garden bloomed quietly. The city murmured in the distance. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Naveed. "Would you consider joining the permanent board for training oversight?" He stared at the message, then smiled faintly. "Let me think about it," he replied. Because he wasn't chasing titles. He had spent decades standing behind a bench, handing down decisions that shaped people's lives. Now all he wanted was to live his own life with dignity. and make sure that dignity wasn't a privilege given to a few, but a standard expected for all. Inside his house, a framed photo sat on a table. Harold at the airline's headquarters, surrounded by trainees, young, old, from every walk of life. Some were smiling, some were still learning, but all of them were listening. The next generation of crew, the next flight, and maybe the next Harold, walking down a jet bridge, quiet, thoughtful, dignified, would never be stopped at the door. Because someone, somewhere, had already changed what that door meant, not with noise, but with truth. And it all began with a man in seat 2A who chose not to walk away quietly, but to stay seated until the world stood up. If this story moved you, make sure to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this one. More are coming soon, and you won't want to miss them.